All right, hey guys, we're going to do traits of wildlife populations today. We're going to do a lab about black-footed ferrets, and I wanted to put this PowerPoint online so that you can go back and reference it. So let's first talk about gene pools and genes. So hopefully you learned a little bit about this in like middle school or even if you have taken biology. But the gene pool is all the genes that are present in a given population at a particular time. So maybe if we're talking about a human population, that could be blue eyes, brown hair, freckles, attached earlobes, rolling the tongue. So these are things that are genes. These are produced by DNA in our genetics. But the gene pool is all of these genes that are added into our gene pool. And adaptation is a way in which living things can have adjusted to their environment. And this is through biology or behavior, and this can improve their chances of survival. And as that happens, it actually changes their genetic code. And so that means that these more favorable traits will get passed on to the next generation. So we know that genes make up the gene pool, and it's important to have a variation, because if we have the same types of genes in the gene pool over and over and over again, it can actually make the population more susceptible to things like disease, predation. It makes them what we like to call a monoculture, and they don't have a whole lot of variation. And there are some wildlife populations that are going through that right now, which we'll talk about in just a minute. So let's talk about the different types of traits we have. We have recessive, which is a trait that's dominated by another gene. A common example that people like to give is eye color, but that's actually a misconception. That's actually a non-Mendelian trait and has to do with more than just recessive and dominant traits. So a better example would be if a person can roll their tongue or not. That's either you can or you can't. And if you can, you have the dominant trait. And if you can't, you have the recessive trait. And the recessive trait doesn't show up as often as the dominant trait, and usually that's because the dominant trait gives the advantage to the organism, where the recessive trait does not. So the dominant trait is the one that's going to be seen more often because they're more common and they generally allow better survivability in a population. Now in humans, that's not as true just because we are able to overcome our differences using our cognition. But in wildlife populations, they don't have the ability or the gray matter in their brain and the cognitive abilities to overcome their maybe their environmental what's around them in their environment. And so it's better to have a dominant gene because usually a dominant gene appears more often because the organisms with dominant genes survive and push their genes onto the next generation. So the example I like to give is giraffes having long necks. So if a giraffe has a long neck, then they have the dominant gene because that is the gene that is more common in the gene pool. If it has a short neck, then it most likely has the recessive gene. That organism is probably not going to survive to breeding age, which means that the dominant gene is the one that gets pushed on to the next generation. If you're a heterozygote, that means that you have both the dominant and the recessive gene, but the dominant gene is what you see. So I hate using this example about eye color, but it's the one everybody knows. If you have brown eyes, that doesn't necessarily mean that if you have kids that your kids won't have blue eyes. So if you have the recessive gene for blue eyes, even though you have brown eyes, if you marry somebody who is also a heterozygote or has a recessive gene or is recessive for blue eyes, then your children might possibly have blue eyes because you actually have that gene, you just don't see it. So genetic variation is really important in a wildlife population. I talked about it on the first slide. But organisms get genetic variations in a myriad of ways, okay? Genetic mutation, which happens during meiosis and mitosis, adaptations, which allow organisms to survive better in their environments. Extinctions obviously play a pretty big role in genetic variation because that population just doesn't exist anymore. Interbreeding, which can actually cause a decrease in genetic variation. Migration and emigration, which means organisms that are going out and coming into the population, they're important because if an organism migrates into the population, it's bringing different genes with it, which increases the genetic variation in that particular gene pool. And then, of course, natural selection. So our giraffes with short necks, for example, a natural selection would probably take them out of the gene pool because they have a low survivability rate. We also know that during meiosis, when crossing over happens, when a sperm and an egg meets and they start to divide, when that crossing over happens, it takes genetic material from the mother and the father and it mixes it, and that also creates one of the biggest genetic variations in a population.
So anyway.
So genetic variation is something that's going to allow an organism to adapt and survive in its environment. But there are ways in which genetic variation can be slowed and halted in a population. Bottleneck effect is one of those ways. So the formal definition of bottleneck effect is when a population experiences a severe change that kills off many individuals, the survivors retain only a portion of the original genetic diversity. This consequence diversity of education and association, genetic characteristics of traits, blah blah blah. Anyway, so basically it just means that if a bunch of individuals are killed off, then only half of the original genes in that gene pool survive. So you're actually losing, like completely and totally losing part of your gene pool. And so the genes that are left are the genes that those organisms are left with to breed. And you also have a reduction of individuals. So a lot of those individuals may be related to one another, and to breed and increase the population, they have to breed with one another. And since related individuals have closer traits, the more that they inbreed, the more closely related they become, and the less traits you have in the gene pool. And so it can do a lot of damage to a population. So we see this bottleneck effect in a lot of populations. You might be familiar with cheetahs, black-footed ferrets, which we have here in Utah, and polar bears. These individuals, because there are so few of them left, they have to breed with one another, and usually they can be siblings or even like mother-son or son or, you know, they're just related to one another. But this can create a really dangerous domino effect because let's say one of these individuals gets a disease. Let's use parvo, for example. Black-footed ferrets are susceptible to parvo, which they get from the domestic dog population. If they're very closely related to one another, and they get parvo, they're all susceptible to it, and so it can actually cause them to go extinct because there is no genetic variation. Is not as much genetic variation in their population that allows some of them to survive because they have the resistance to that disease. So it's really important that we have this genetic variation in our gene pool, because if we don't, then a lot of individuals, since they're so closely related to one another, can actually be taken out of the population. So we'll be doing a lab about black-footed ferrets and how the bottleneck effect plays a role in their population numbers, and what zoos are doing to try and reintroduce them back into the population, and what the risks are for zoos to do that. So